Have you ever read the Bible and you've come across passages that you don't really know how to explain and you feel a little bit uncomfortable? What am I talking about? Well, let me show you. Genesis chapter 5. There's an elephant in the room. It talks about the lifespans of the descendants from Adam to Noah. It says Adam lived to be 930 years and then he died. Seth, 912 years and he died. Enosh, 905 years and he died. Kenan, 910. Mahalalel lived to be 895 years and he died. Jared lived to be 962 years. And then there's the baby of the bunch, Enoch. Enoch lived to be 365 years, but, and here's the deal, he did not die. And we'll talk about that at the end of the video. Methuselah, his son, lived to be 969 years. And if that's not enough, he actually had his kid Lamech when he was 782 years of age. And eventually we find out that Lamech himself lived to be 777 years of age. So what's going on here? Well, that's what I want to talk about next on the Midweek Snack. Cue the music. Okay, well, we have an elephant in the room and we're going to talk about it. And you might not like all the answers, but at least we're going to talk about it. And the reason why it's important is because there are a lot of people that are non-Christians that simply, they look at the Bible and they think, those early stories of the Bible from Genesis, the lifespans that people lived, that they were the only humans that existed, those are really hard for me to accept. And for a lot of people, that is the dividing point between them actually making a commitment to God and just simply walking away and saying, I don't want to have anything to do with your faith. It doesn't make sense. Like my mom used to say, it sounds to them to be ridiculous. Okay, so let's look at how we address this. First of all, we acknowledge the problem. And here's a graph here. You can actually see an overlap of all these characters from Seth all the way to Noah. And if you look at this line, the little horizontal line there, of course, going down, the vertical line, is the flood. That is when the flood happened. And you can see that most of these folks actually knew each other amazingly, even though there was a 10-generation thing going on here. With the exception of Enoch, who lived to be 365 years. Well, he actually didn't live to be 365 years. He was actually taken up by God. He was translated. Everybody else knew each other. That's pretty phenomenal. But again, that's pretty hard to believe, okay? So that's the elephant in the room. And I want to look at it and I want to talk about how would you address this to somebody who is a skeptic or somebody who was doubting what you believed. First of all, you don't want to try to convince them. You're not trying to argue with them. You're not trying to look down with them. You're simply just trying to explain why you hold to your position. That's it. And that's all that you really should do. So with that said, I want to go ahead and look at about 4 different views that people have when it comes to these crazy lifespans that are demonstrated in Genesis chapter 5, which is really the apex of these ages. Every time you go from there, from the Bible, they go significantly lower. But you got to deal with these first 10 generations, the most difficult thing to do. So the first view here I want to talk about is called the literal historical view. And basically, they believe, hey, they really did live that long. So believers who take this viewpoint, they accept the ages of face value. Methuselah lived to be 969 years. He had a child when he was 782 years of age. Case closed. But they also have reasons why they believe that. It's not just because they're closing their eyes and their ears, but they'll say things like, okay, here are some reasons. I'll give you three. Some hold that humanity actually, they live closer to perfection. And it was after creation, it was relatively new, and the human body was relatively new. And so, therefore, it actually had fewer genetic defects, less sin, less things coming from your ancient ancestors like we have today in our culture. So, that would be one argument in their favor that they would hold. Number two, they would say the environment was completely different back then. And they have this thing called the water canopy theory, that somehow there was an atmospheric kind of condition, a water canopy, if you will, that actually kept radiation from coming in and affecting us like it affects us today. And so, therefore, they say it's scientifically possible for us to genetically live longer time periods in a perfect climate like that was at creation. Okay. So that's the argument. They argue about the firmament. What was that exactly? And then thirdly, they'll say things like, God simply allowed longer lifespans back then. It's the early part of history, and this is all part of his plan because it was important when there were no people to be fruitful and multiply. And there's no better way than to be fruitful and multiply than to allow people to live 900 plus years. Okay. That's the argument. That's what you believe, and that's fine. Your strength of your argument is simply this. When someone asks you, it's like, hey, it fits a straightforward reading of the text. I read the Bible, this is what it says. And so what I do is I don't try to come up with a different view that helps to support this, but instead I think to myself, okay, this is what I believe. These are the problems. How do I reconcile them? Okay. And the honest challenge is, hey, this is difficult to reconcile with Western modern biology and science that we know today. People simply don't live that long. Even 365 years, right? Wow, who lived that long? So people that simply cannot accept this as literal, they have to find another way to accept this. And so that brings us to theory number two. Okay, the symbolic or the theological view. They view the ages here of the folks here as symbolic rather than literal. And it's trying to communicate a message, and it's our job to interpret the message that it's trying to communicate, right? So, for example, long ages, 969 years, or Jared, 962 years, they would say that it symbolizes greatness. It symbolizes wisdom. It symbolizes a person that's actually drawn really close to God. A person like, for example, Enoch, who we're told walked with God. Okay. This view would also say that the numbers itself, they often carry these theological meanings. So the number is packed, in other words. So numbers like 7, right? God's perfect number. When he talked about creation, that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. So somehow from that point in time, he adopted the number 7. It meant that his work was complete in creation. And so you have 7-day weeks, and you have the Sabbath, and you have various things that really focus on the number 7 years. You can be forgiven your debt. You can be set free if you're a slave. Those are the kind of things. So numbers like 7 and 10, 3, 60, 100, those are numbers that people say they are actually packed with meaning, right? 40 years in the wilderness. Have you ever wondered why Moses and Elijah and John the Baptist, or Jesus, pardon me, spent 40 years or 40 days? Like the number 40 seems to signify something, okay? So this view sees genealogies, they view it as a literary structure, and it's not strictly historical accurate. For example, they see Enoch, that he lived, well, pardon me, I keep saying he lived, but he was taken by God at the age of 365 years. And so they would say, hey, I think this is something you have to really look at, because This is hinting at a solar year. We all know that a year consists of 365 days. And so maybe this is suggesting an order or some kind of a design that was to basically follow from this person of Enoch who walked with God. So the strengths of this view is that it respects the text structure. It sees that the author is creating this structure in such a way that is similar to other ancient literary traditions that happen over time. But the challenge is this, right? It's pretty easy to understand the challenge. It's harder to pin down the precise meaning of a specific number. Like I said, we can pretty much feel comfortable with the number 7, but some of these other numbers, even 365, are we reading our Western mindset into this equation? It's a question that you have to be able to answer because it's harder to pin down things if you do not know what the actual literary meaning of that number entails. So thirdly, there's a numerical calendar that they use that's different than our calendar, okay? So for example, some propose that there is actually the years that are mentioned in this genealogy are not solar years, but they're lunar months that are mentioned, right? And there's like 360 days, and it's just a different number that over time, it is significantly less. So others will suggest things like Methuselah, his age, 969 years. Well, if you use that according to the lunar calendar, guess how old Methuselah would have died at? 80 years old. Now, from a Western perspective, that sounds a lot more doable, right? Hey, I'm more likely to listen now because that makes sense. Others suggest that they multiplied and they divided by a different kind of a system, multiplied by 7s or added by 7s, or they use the number 60 system that's been used in Mesopotamia in some of the cuneiforms. And so they would say that no, the numbering, the counting systems that they used back then were not what we think it is today. And we're trying to interpret it from a Western perspective. Methuselah was not 969 years. He was 80, as an example. Okay. So what are the strengths of this position? It attempts to harmonize the text with the natural lifespans. It tries to make people understand, hey, this was a different kind of numbering system, but it ends up being the same as we experience in our lives today. And so what is the challenge? Well, there's always a challenge in every position. The challenge is there are inconsistent results. If Methuselah actually was 80 years old instead of 969 years, what that means is that when he had Noah, he had him at the age of 5 years. 5 years old, and Methuselah would have been a father. And so you see there's inconsistency. It is hard to say, hey, we have to use lunar numbers because sometimes lunar numbers don't even make sense. So it's just important to know these views because it helps you when you're trying to communicate apologetically to other people that have a problem. They have these hurdles that they can't get over. Not everybody holds to the same position. Okay, the fourth one that I want to talk about is called the cultural parallel. Also could be used as an apologetic. And this is what I mean. So in the ancient Near East, for example, there are texts, there are lists, there are genealogies like the Sumerian king list that show rulers who were living for thousands of years. I mean, to be honest, Methuselah would be a pup compared to some of these kings. But when they show these kings, the interesting thing is they don't necessarily show how old they were when they died. They showed how long they reigned for as kings. Okay. So this view would basically say that they see Genesis as drawing from and reacting to those traditions like the Sumerian king's list, but they do so with a moral or a theological message that emphasizes, it emphasizes that God is a person that cares about not how successful you are, but how moral and how much you want to follow God. And we'll look at a Sumerian list in a second, because I think there's some surprising similarities that I think are worth noting. Okay. So this view emphasizes God's control of history. It states that there was a decline of humanity, just like the other different views, and that it actually led to an actual flood, right? Because when we look at the Sumerian list, it's actually the first 10 generations are listed, and it leads to a flood. Okay. So that's the strength of a position like that. But when it comes to some of the challenges that take place, it's like, what do I do with the numbers? Because I can't, do I accept them at face value, or how old were they? Like we have unanswered questions that still take place when it comes to the cultural parallel view that's used as an apologetic. But I do think in the Bible, there are many references that actually do use this view as an apologetic. For example, Leviathan and the sea monsters was a big theme in the Mesopotamia kind of region. And in the Bible, there are Psalms that talk about that Yahweh crushed the serpent's heads. There are references there that take something from another culture and say, hey, your god Marduk didn't destroy this sea monster. No, that person was Yahweh. And he's only one. He's not a bunch of different gods. You're not counting on the storm god or the sun god. Yahweh is one. Okay. So, an apologetic to our culture. And here's the list that I wanted to show you. It's called the Sumerian King List. And it's comparing itself here to Genesis chapter 5. But anyway, in this list, and this list, by the way, is found in a Sumerian tablet, okay? And this tablet is kind of this four-corner kind of object that you can spin around, and it lists the last 10 generations before the flood. And so like the faith of Yahweh, right? They also believe in the flood, and they list their 10 generations before the flood, just like the Bible lists the 10 generations of Adam before the flood. And look at the similarities, okay? Now, initially, we were concerned about how long the people in the Bible lived, right? But when you look at how long the reigns of these kings were for Sumerians, you find out that these guys are puppies. Like these guys, even Methuselah, he didn't even make it to 1,000. But when you look at these kings, some of them reigned for 67,200 years. There's 72,000 year reigns. And it looks like the minimum on this tablet, this cuneiform, is 18,000 years. And so why would the Sumerians say that the reigns of these kings were so long? A lot of historians that say for those that actually hold to these age groups, it's meant to be a political thing, to basically to emphasize to the people these kings and how prominent they were and how great their kingdoms were, and that you have to line yourself up with that kind of a kingdom. Now, there is something that I want to point out here that's also worth noting. Notice that the seventh generation of the Sumerian king and the seventh generation of what we call the patriarchs, or the people that lived in the genealogy of Seth, the seventh generation is Enoch in the Bible, who we already mentioned lived for 365 years and then God took him. But the Sumerian king, his name is Enmedu-Ranke. And he also was taken up. He did not experience death. Okay, and so here's where the apologetic goes. You have a neighboring country come up to you and they say, here's what we believe. And here's how great our kings were. And you already seen our civilizations like Babylon and Assyria. You've seen the power that's associated with. You've seen how many people we conquered. You've seen how technologically advanced these kingdoms were. Well, you know why they were so advanced and why the technology was so great and why they were able to build these monoliths? According to the Sumerian tradition, Enmeduranke, he was taken up and he became a part of the divine council, is given the divine tablets. And what are these tablets for? They are the advancements of the gods. And so things like divination, things like using metal to fashion weapons and spears and swords and armor, building, chariots, and basically using metal and resources and craftsmanship to become powerful nations, and using divinity, using sorcery to basically communicate to everybody else there, we possess the secret arts. And so Enmeduranke, that's what he received because he was a king that must have had a great kingdom that must have reigned for a long time, and only to be exaggerated in the genealogies by the person that was the scribe, if you will, of these cuneiform tablets. Now, how would the Israelite use this as an apologetic to their neighboring friends in Mesopotamia? Well, they would basically say, Genesis chapter 5 talks about our list, our 10 generations that lead eventually to the flood. And though there are similarities, because here are the similarities. Number one, the Sumerian king represented the seventh generation, just like Enoch. And again, that number 7 is a special number. And like Enoch, Enmeduranke was taken up and he didn't experience death. But there's a significant difference between these two. And that's where these two would get together, these neighboring countries, and they would share their views. And so in the case of the Sumerian king, for example, he became part of this divine council and he was rewarded these things that the Bible simply outlaws, these practices of the occult, this taking of life and killing. These are the things that they were awarded to do, and they were able to have these secrets. But when it came to Enoch, it wasn't about his ability to reign, to be a king, to be a part of a great civilization that has technological advancements or that uses divinity or other practices. No, what we learned from Enoch is that he was somebody that walked with God. And he walked with God in an era that was simply very difficult to walk with God, when it says that every inclination of mankind's thoughts were evil all the time. Blood was being spilled consistently. These were the circumstances that led to the flood. But there was a man like Enoch who, it says in the Bible, walked with God. And what kind of man was Enoch? It talks about him in Jude verses 14 and 15. Enoch was this guy. He was a prophet. He was a preacher. He would prophesy that God's going to pronounce judgment on the ungodly people like you all. He's going to bring about a flood. He's going to bring about at the end time this messianic figure that's going to judge the world because of all the ungodliness. And remember, Jude uses a quote from Enoch, where Enoch basically says 4 times, ungodly, 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 and they practice ungodliness. So Enoch is rewarded because of he walked with God. He stood up for God in a difficult time. And then Hebrews tells us that he was a man of faith. He was a man of faith that pleased God. And goes on to say that without faith, it is impossible to please God. And so, what is the apologetic that's being communicated here to the Mesopotamian neighbor? Well, your kings were rewarded for wickedness. Your kings were rewarded for their acquisitions of killing people, for building civilizations, for spreading divination, for child sacrifices, for worshiping all the different gods. But Enoch represents us. We're just people that are human, that we're not ruling, but we are actually walking with God. And so the apologetic for the Christian is simply this: God cares about our moral behavior. He cares about that we represent him as imagers of God. That's what's important to God is our character. And doesn't that make you feel good as a follower of Jesus? Because it communicates the fact that I don't have to have this great, fantastic skill set. I don't have to know everything. God simply says, I've made you who you are. And if you walk with me, it says in Hebrews, it says that God rewards those that have faith because it pleases him. And ultimately, Enoch was rewarded to be translated to heaven, not because of what he accomplished in his life, because of his faith that he had in God, because of his character and his commitment. And so that's the end of what we're going to talk about today. But I just want to end by saying, always recognize that there are going to be people that have different opinions about things with you. But you just have to come to terms with what you believe about things like the genealogies in Genesis chapter 5. And you have to understand that people will think differently, and that's okay. Because what will win them to the faith is how God uses your character and how God allows the Holy Spirit to minister to people. So that's what I wanted to communicate today. I wanted to talk about the elephant in the room. I hope this was helpful. And until the next time, God bless everybody. Until we meet again on the Midweek Snack.